In some way. I say it all the time in some way. And in trying to explore where this came from, I've gone down a lot of different tracks. But since today is UNESCO's World Philosophy Day, I thought I'd talk a little bit about philosophical developments and how they may have influenced counseling. So, if we're going to start here, I think that maybe the logical place to start might be starting with Freud. Freud was an individual within a context, within a time. There had many influences, one of them being German idealism of really trying to capture as much of the complexity of the topic as possible. This could be seen in Hegel, it could be seen in Kant, and virtually impossible to do, but very important undertaking. That was on one side of it, which led to the allowance of being skeptical of previous schemas, previous ideologies, which allowed for kind of creativity. But Freud was also working in a time of the burgeoning rise of logical positivism or science. And science was understood a little bit differently at that time in Vienna, of potentially including art and literary criticism, become much more hard sciences in our contemporary context in the United States. Now, Freud wasn't the first to try to create an ideology or framework that would explain consciousness. We could go back to Descartes' self-evaluation of his own consciousness, or we could look at Wundt's having people talk and then in some kind of early qualitative manner trying to analyze what they said so we could understand how consciousness worked in some way. So with the Enlightenment, that the need and rigor for scientific proof increased. Freud's vision was that his ideas would eventually, although he knew this couldn't happen in his lifetime, be explained through biological methods, and that we would be able to prove what would happen. Now, after Freud, we had Karl Popper, who put forth this idea that nothing is true if it can't be disproven. So this has put many ideas to the test. And many of the ideas in counseling are very difficult, if not bordering on impossible to prove. But Freud was hoping to try to create a system that in some way could be tested over time. I think the third big influence that is throughout Western thought is these ideas of structuralism, that things are, if we can look deeper, we can see the latent categories that things fit into. So a common one that comes up when people discuss Freud and the historical roots is the tripartite model of id, superego, and ego, right? People told Freud that he stole that from Plato, and the idea of the charioteer, which would be the ego. And on one side, you have a kind of a well-behaved superego horse that does what's expected. And on the other side, you have the wild it horse going with kind of impulses and impulsivity. There's also the reflection that this could have been influenced by some of the Christian philosophers, that a person is stuck between the influences of the devil on one side and the influences of God on another side. So postmoderns would see these as kind of meta-narratives of how we would understand the world. And Deleuze and Guattari suggested that all works in psychology are very important, very applicable, very even pragmatic works of fiction, but in no way are they true. So after Freud, this idea of structuralism really gained ground, particularly with Claude Lévi-Strauss, that believed that there could be ways of us looking at the world to understand its underlying rules, its underlying norms, its underlying taboos, its underlying ideas about pro-social behavior. and that meaning can be derived in a deeper way by not just looking at the passing phenomena, but by applying some kind of larger latent structures that explain things. So this came up with the idea of structuralism is often seen as coming out of linguistics or linguistic philosophy, and that language or language is a closed system where words mean a particular thing, and words, particularly thinking of de Souza here, that they mean something different from other words. When Freud was still alive, there was competing ideas about this modernist, scientific, Enlightenment influenced world that he was creating in. And since that time, that's the energy towards deconstructing the Enlightenment paradigms or meta narratives was taken up great by postmodern thought, criticisms of modernity. It's seen these ideas of modernity can be seen as primary belief systems or meta narratives in this concept of whiteness that's throughout our culture. So, as happens in academic thought or theoretical thought or the field of counseling or the field of psychology or cultural criticism, is that whenever an idea is presented, it can be looked at, deconstructed. Post Freud, there was a large movement called the Frankfurt School that kind of critically analyzed many of the rules around economy, power, authority. In my first psychoanalytic course I took, it was on Karen Horney, who was seen as an original kind of feminist psychoanalytic thinker who repeatedly challenged many of Freud's ideas and thinking more about relational energies that we may have as opposed to strict drives and challenging the various changing drives that Freud proposed or kind of core vectors that we had to manage in some way. And I think maybe one of the most famous ideas is where Horney challenged the idea of penis envy with womb envy. And I think having this very early on in my training brought this kind of critical thought. So if we're thinking of other critical theorists, we're thinking of Eric Fromm and Adorno, but that basically what we believe may not be absolutely accurate. And this would move into eventually postmodernism and post-structuralism. As Hegel would have maybe suggested, or we can force this analogy on here, is that structuralism was a thesis, and then there was presented with an antithesis, which is post-structuralism. And then there, in Hegel's idea, there'd be a synthesis. But I think when we're talking about post-structuralism, there's really not a synthesis. So some of these kind of core ideas would be language cannot be fully captured reality, that we're cut off by language, and you can see this in Lacan. And that really reality is very ambiguous. Our ideas about language can be very contradictory and filled with paradox. That moving into power dynamics, that really no word or role is truly neutral, that gender, binaries, roles in society are subject to oppression, prejudice. So this movement continues now in critical psychology, where we can deconstruct any of the ideas that are happening in psychology and kind of point out its contradictions, what might be missing from that theory in some way. And very important idea, and while there's many influences, say, in the current social justice movement of people before this, I think of Frederick Douglass or indigenous writers that were challenging the power structures and the norms and the roles and the organization of a culture that potentially in the West, in the Western psychology, this idea of critical psychology had and continues to have a very big or major influence. Also, moving out of this post-structuralist idea and moving out of these critical theory ideas, taking it a step further was this movement towards postmodernism. So maybe I'll cover just a few postmodernists and kind of some of their general ideas. And I think my question for you would be to see if these make sense, to see if they have snuck into your thinking about the field and maybe influencing your clinical work or your theory development. So when we think of postmodernism, we think of grand narratives, we think of meta narratives, and we can think of Lyotard's postmodern condition, where basically challenged the idea that enlightenment is moving us towards progress, challenge the various psychological views that they may not be universally true, even challenge the idea that we're moving towards some soteriological, or teleological betterment. And I'm worried as I talk about this that I may have some of this in my talk. A question would be for Lyotard, like, what is the meta narrative? Who benefits from that and who gets erased? After Lyotard, or similarly creating a potentially the most famous postmodern, who was Foucault. Foucault, as we can find also in Deleuze, felt that truth is created, meta-narratives are created through power structures to control, and that organizations, institutions, these days we can say even more, the media kind of controls what we are even exposed to in our thinking and reinforces how we should think. And this can happen in our educational system. So Foucault is a very big influence on Kimberly Crenshaw, who I'll talk about later. We think about the impact of language when we think about postmodernism, how language isn't exact and that there are cracks in language. And if we try to have a dialogue and conversation and we ask each other these phenomenological questions, what does that mean to you? And we had a group, people will have different kind of meanings, associations, and signifiers for almost any word, right? This was a criticism, particularly of some of the dualistic ideas that are so prevalent in Western thought, right? And then a bunch of people took on this idea of identity, and particularly thinking of Judith Butler in terms of gender identity and the influence and impacts of social norms and how we experience ourselves and how we are allowed to present ourselves and how we're performing at any moment in the various ways the culture defines as okay, and then rebelling against that, that we can potentially be more of our true selves as opposed to just falling into a predetermined role in some way. I always like Bulliard's idea of the spectacle, and that as events impacts how they're covered, there's branding that draws us in, emotionally influences us to think this way or that way, and that we're really not seeing the whole picture. We're caught in a partial picture, and we're not seeing what might be called the real. My favorite of the postmodernists is Deleuze, who really stressed these ideas of anti-enlightenment, of our scientific methods overly reduce cause and effect, and that there's a real multiplicity, almost an endless array of factors that go into any event that takes place, and a real celebration of difference, and that this is how we learn, right? I often use the cliche in my work as a group leader that through similarities we might feel connected, but it's only through difference that we really grow and learn. You can see how some of these ideas might be seen in liberation psychology, some social justice, that the world is inevitably subjective and it privileges some perspectives and some identities more than other identities. Or as Winnicott said, our cultural mother doesn't treat all their children equally or fairly. or provides more for some, more than the others. So when we're thinking about postmodern thought and counseling, we're looking through all the meta narratives. I have a joke with, probably went back to my mother, and now I have, rest in peace, now I have a joke with my son that almost the first answer we should explore when considering any question is that the answer may be neoliberal late stage capitalism. So this is one view of the waters we swim in our contemporary context, which has these ideas of meritocracy and fairness and oversimplifying identity to maybe dyadic or dualistic perspectives. And how can we embrace more flexibility as seen in the best practices in diversity and inclusion counseling? How can we look at the narratives that clients bring us about their past? How might they be impacted by sociocultural narratives? So traditionally, counseling might have put a big focus on family of origin. But I think as we move into this postmodern position, we're looking at do people believe that are cognitive schemas and rules that are not only coming from their culture and their family, but potentially from the larger culture. And I see this all the time when people behave in some way that's outside the meta narratives of what's allowed or norms, and they might feel guilt or shame about it. So the idea here is that there's really no foundational truth. I like the Zen saying that what is Zen? It's the finger pointing at the moon. It shows you a direction. It gives you an idea of where to look. But depending whether you're on a mountainside or in a valley or north or south, that even how we see the moon in the context of where we are will make a difference in some way. So one of the criticisms of postmodern thought is we don't know what is true. We doubt everything. We bring a lot of skepticism. We know that everything is wound up in language and history and power structures. And as a counselor, as much as I like these ideas, I would ask the question of, okay, now what? I'm working with a client. What might I do or not do? And depending on your training and the tradition you may identify with, there can be many rules of doing this or doing that. And I think of the story, I did my first ground rounds when I was a doctoral student. So I was presenting a case and I was very nervous. I worked really hard on the case conceptualization. I think I was within 3 minutes in where people started yelling at me that it's a withdrawal from the ego, it's societal oppression, it's adopting a false self and not a true self. It was aggression turned on themselves. I didn't feel like people were hearing the case, but really bringing these meta narratives to what they were hearing that I was saying. So following this postmodern deconstruction of truth's reality, highlighting subjectivity, deconstructing norms of behavior doesn't really inform us how to move forward as counselors, although I think these are essential ideas. So in the field of philosophy, I think one of the figures that came after this period would be Richard Rorty, sometimes referred to as postmodern pragmatism. So I think of clinical work is almost as a existential dilemma where we have freedom, we have choice, we have responsibility. But what do we do in these clinical engagements? How do we help people? So Rorty had this idea, some basic ideas of Rorty, which is much bigger than counseling. And I see very little work being integrated into psychology, more into science, more into philosophy, and has been and continues to be, I think, what I experience almost a mocked figure. But these basic ideas, maybe going back, we're going to talk about psychology going back to James's pragmatism. So we're looking at what works, what might help, right? It's a denial of these grand theories and these fundamentalist ideas that we have to follow, but we must make a decision about what to do. I think we're looking at our clients from Nori's perspective as the narrative is a self. It's constantly being rewritten. You think of narrative therapy, that we're constantly revising and rewriting stories, creating new potential meanings, maybe constructing in this tradition a more livable story in some way. We're open to ideas being redescribed. I think Rorty would say he'd often refer to himself as an ironist, that we should hold on to our theories lightly, that we should be really epistemologically humble, that we are coming from a subjective perspective given our life story and history, and that inevitably we're missing something. I remember listening to an interview with Rorty where they were talking about Martin Luther King's idea that the arc of history goes positively, and the role of empathy in creating progressive actions in the world. And he expressed respect and gratitude and really said that he really wants to believe these ideas. And there's a lot of evidence for these perspectives, but couldn't say with certainty that this is what exactly is happening. I think he said he hopes that human beings are naturally empathetic, as I'm imagining we all do. Another influential figure, I think, in our field, although came out of the philosophy and legal professions, would be Kimberly Crenshaw, who's sometimes referred to applied postmodernism. So most famous for the work on intersectionality, that while the culture will look at things in dyads and reduce them, that things are much more have much more multiplicity and much more complexity. The famous case in which she argued that the bias and oppression, mistreatment of African American women are different than just African Americans or different than women. And that by looking at more factors, we might see what's occurring in a fuller way. Now, while Crenshaw, building off of Foucault, would say that these labels are socially constructed in language and through power and through traditions, that they exist. They exist in our culture, and they have profound impacts on the people we work with, and that we can't deny them. We must feel them. We must work to create change. I think in terms of clinical work, I think of Walt Whitman. Everyone includes multitudes. And can we get too caught up in kind of one paradigm, one way of understanding others, that's missing the complexity of their lived experience? And can we continue to broaden? And also important, can we take action from this position of being understanding there's meta-narratives, understanding these aren't true, but understanding that they're deeply impacting people? And can we find a way to engage with these to change, whether it's meta-narratives and roles and bias within the culture, or potentially within just a single psychotherapy client? I wondered why I resonated with the ideas of Rorty and Crenshaw so much. I think 10 of my last 20 articles probably focus primarily on intersectionality and trying probably poorly to bridge the gap between Crenshaw's ideas and contemporary counseling. And as I reflect on this, I think back upon my career. And early in my career, when I first entered psychoanalytic school, my first analyst, after interviewing multiple training analysts, would sit with me, next to me in a chair, and we'd look out the window together and talk as we looked at the hustle and bustle of the streets of Philadelphia. He eventually steered me to one of his students who, in her office, she just had a thick rug and pillows. And I had the choice to go in and lay down in one area or another, or sit up, look at her, look away. Extreme freedom. Now, both of this is in this tradition that I'm most rigorously trained in of modern psychoanalysis, 30 years of personal analysis and 30 years of supervision. But I think what either it struck a chord with me or it influenced me was some of these kind of thoughts of the founders. So there's a Hyman Spotnitz, who was a founder, would be asked, what do you do with a client? And his response would be like, whatever worked. There's a story of him presenting a case in which the client came in and said they were hungry, and he went to his desk and got out some food for the client to eat, as opposed to the rigid trend in psychoanalysis of that time of trying to explore the resistance to change or resistance to the analytic process by coming to the session hungry in some way. You also think about Lou Ormont, who pioneered the ideas of modern group analysis and would often say that, although impossible, that he worked from a theory of technique. So really putting personality theory off to the side. And you could have a relational drive, or you could want to be part of a community, or you could be touching base with various archetypes. But really, what do we do in therapy? So I think this had a profound impact of me and my continually passionate view of this process variables or process factors or change factors in psychotherapy, and how can we study these, and are there any similarities across clients or across contexts? And of course, putting a postmodern lens on this would mean that every client, every group might need different processes. And from this postmodern view, there is no universal true rule of personality theory that would fit across everyone in the world or everyone within a culture. And similarly, there is no universal idea of what processes may be most beneficial for any group, that it's very much a challenge of being in the moment, coming up with some conceptualization about our clients or the group, critically examining these, using our best predictive skills, getting lots and lots of supervision, and at some point having the existential courage to act with our clients, to proceed in some manner, knowing that from this perspective that we may not know, but we may know some things, but we don't know everything. And psychotherapy will never be a clear, systematic A leads to B leads to C with every person. It's not an easy way to necessarily work. Sometimes I think about kind of the models of ethical decision making, of trying to understand the situation in front of you from as many perspectives, considering all the stakeholders. I like to ask the question of myself, or when I'm in supervision, what might I be missing? Where am I stuck in some meta narrative that's making me have glasses on where I'm not seeing the client as accurately as I could? Ideally, I'm a believer in group, and whether it's the groups I'm a part of, as a supervisee of the groups I lead, as a supervisor, having as many different foundational trainings, perspectives as possible, I think allows us to maybe broaden our perspective. Of course, we try to do no harm and try to do good. We must accept that we may never know the outcome of what we're doing, but if we can critically analyze it and make good decisions, that we have the best likelihood of being helpful or constructive to the client. I think one way to approach this is to learn about as many different theories as you can, and but also to read the criticisms of those theories, where they're missing, why people dislike them. And you can see a lot of this in critical psychology. But I think where applied postmodernism comes in is that going beyond just the critiques is the reality of taking action in the world. I feel as a general theme, although Saywardy and Crenshaw's ideas are outside of counseling, I feel like some of the general movements in counseling are looking at things as more of a spectrum, breaking out of rigid definitions that are often dyadic of this or it's that, considering the client's subjectivity, lived experience, the multiplicity of factors that has impacted the client coming up into this moment, considering the trajectory of the treatment and how that may be impacting where you are in the treatment, considering the previous theories as wonderful, applicable, necessary works of fiction, but potentially not true. But by knowing what a wide varieties of others thought and viewed and how they worked in terms of psychotherapy might provide us more options and might provide us ideas of how to proceed, and then also some critiques against why we may not want to proceed this way. So I like to, the general research is that psychotherapy is effective, although it's showing a little less effectiveness in previous years of these studies, is that this is a helpful process. I'm a believer. Being in treatment changed my life in so many ways, and I've seen that do that for many others and for many of my clients. And of course, I have the question of, am I just seeing this because I want to see this, or from my training, or from the research I read? So it's living with this doubt, it's living with this uncertainty, it's living with extreme epistemological humility. When we look at the general skills that they see in effective psychotherapists now, some of these include being able to tolerate ambiguity, being able to tolerate complexity, critical thinking skills, clinical flexibility. So I feel, I'm not sure of the multiplicity of causes, but I do wonder if, since it's World Philosophy Day, if there's been some influence of the waves of philosophy on our field that they may become meta-narratives and they may seem stupid down the road, but are they impacting us? I think the idea here is that both as people, as clinicians, we're never ending. It's an unfolding story. The field is an unfolding story. And despite that, better to act potentially and be open in dialogue, consider other perspectives than to withdraw. I think for people who become therapists and stay with it, this would be a meta-narrative that it's some form of calling or true self. And I don't know if that's true or not, but something to consider. And it's definitely a meaningful journey. Take care.